Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. At the end of the last lecture, we talked about all the reasons why Benjamin Franklin needed to leave Boston. He had violated his apprenticeship with his brother James. James went around and talked to all the other printers, so none of them wanted to hire Ben. Ben's family was upset with him, thought he should go back to work for James. There were accusations of him being a heretic because of some of his unusual religious views. And also, he was a person of some suspicion by local authorities in Boston because of some of the things he wrote in his brother's newspaper while his brother was in jail. So at 17 years old, Benjamin Franklin decides to leave Boston and try to create a life somewhere else. His first idea was to go to New York. And so he headed to New York City, got on a boat and headed to New York City and looked for employment as a printer. But he couldn't find a job there. The best he could do was he met a man there by the name of Bradford. That was his last name. And Bradford told Franklin he didn't have any work for him, but he did have a son down in Philadelphia. And the last time he had heard from his son was having a difficult time finding someone to work in his printing house. So Bradford told him, look, if you don't have any other prospects here in New York and you want to go somewhere else, maybe go down to Philadelphia and look up my son and maybe he'll have some work for you. This was the best option seemingly available to Franklin, so he heads down to Philadelphia. Once again, gets on actually multiple boats to get down there and arrives in Philadelphia. Now, Franklin's entrance into the city of Philadelphia is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, story from the autobiography. And it's famous because it is Franklin's really the beginning of his rags to riches tale as sort of an adult as we get into it. This is where the rags to riches story really starts, and he couches it in those terms from his description in the entrance to Philadelphia. So I'm going to read a few of the paragraphs and we'll talk about how he's setting up this rags to riches story as we go through it. This is from page 17 or 18 in your book. So he begins, I've been the more particular in my description of my journey, and shall be so of my first entry into that city being Philadelphia, that you may in your mind compare such unlikely beginnings with the figure I have since made there. In other words, when Franklin's writing this at 65 years old, he's rich, he's famous, and he's extraordinarily well connected in Philadelphia. In fact, Benjamin Franklin is still very much identified with Philadelphia today. If you go to Philadelphia, you see Franklin's image all over the place, on libraries because he helped create the library system in Philadelphia, on fire departments because he created the fire department in Philadelphia. He's just all over the place. And that was true in his own time. So he's telling the reader, he's telling us, I know I've been talking a lot about my journey from Boston to get to Philadelphia now. And I'm going to continue talking about it in a lot of detail because I want you to note the difference between the man I am now, rich, famous, well-connected, important person in the city of Philadelphia, and where this story started. A punk-ass 17-year-old without a lot of money, clueless, walking into this city, as we will see. I was in my working dress, my best clothes being to come around by sea. I was dirty from my journey. My pockets were stuffed out with shirts and stockings, and I knew no soul, nor where to look for lodging. I was fatigued with traveling, rowing, and want of rest. I was very hungry, and my whole stock of cash consisted of a Dutch dollar and about a shilling in copper. The later I gave the people in the boat for my passage, who at first refused it on account of my rowing, but I insisted their taking it. A man sometimes being more generous when he has but a little money than when he has plenty, perhaps through fear of being thought of but little. That's another really interesting insight into human nature. We'll get back to that, but let's go back. And so he's talking about his possessions and what he had as he's getting to Philadelphia. He tells us he was in his working clothes. He'd been doing a lot of rowing on the boat. The boat had been on rivers where they were doing more rowing to speed things up. He didn't have any clothes to change into when he got to the city of Philadelphia to make himself look more presentable as he walked into the city. That clothing was on a different boat. So he was going to walk into the city dirty, with dirty clothes on. And not only the dirty clothes he was wearing, but he had some dirty clothes that were literally hanging out of his pockets because he just sort of stuffed them in there. He was tired, didn't get a lot of sleep on the boat. He was doing a lot of rowing, probably pretty smelly. He was hungry, and he didn't have much money. Remember, it wasn't Franklin's idea that he was going to go a whole extra journey down to Philadelphia. He thought he was going to go to New York and make a living there. And so he was starting to run low on cash. He didn't have much money left. And he said of the little money that he had left, he gave some of it for his passage on the boat. He did a lot of rowing, and he said when it came time to pay in Philadelphia as he got off the boat, they told him, no, it's okay, you don't have to pay. You did a lot of rowing, we appreciate it. I suspect there's also something else going on. I suspect the owner of the boat took some pity on this young man that seemed like a nice, helpful, hardworking man. He probably told him his story. I'm going to Philadelphia. I'm trying to make my living. I don't know anybody there. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do. And he seemed like a nice kid who was doing a lot of rowing. So the owner of the boat told him, it's okay, you don't have to pay. But he insisted on paying. Now that might seem really strange because we've already talked in some detail about how Benjamin Franklin liked to save money. And he did not like to waste money on things he didn't need to waste. And here seems like a perfect opportunity to save money. Someone is literally telling him, do not give me money. And Benjamin Franklin is insisting on giving money. Why? Well, Franklin makes this observation about human nature. A man sometimes being more generous when he has but a little money than when he has plenty, perhaps through fear of being thought to have but little. In other words, Franklin's telling us, in his observation, the only thing worse than being poor is having people think you are poor. And sometimes when you're low on money, you will actually spend money to try to prove to people you have money. It's a really interesting insight. I think he's on to something. I think he's right about something. I think if this very same scenario had happened, where Ben went to a city, did a lot of rowing, got off the boat to pay, but instead he was a well-dressed 65-year-old man who clearly looked like he had money. And then when the boatkeeper said, we really appreciate all the rowing you did. You don't have to pay. Secure, confident, wealthy-looking Benjamin Franklin at 65 probably would have said, well, thank you very much. I will keep my money. But 17-year-old, insecure, worried about people thinking him poor Franklin insisted on paying precisely because he was fearful of people thinking that he was broke. Interesting observation. All right. So he gets off the boat and now is about to start walking the streets of Philadelphia. Then I walked up the street, gazing about till near Market House, I met a boy with bread. I had made many a meal on bread. Franklin was still a vegetarian at this point. Damn right, he probably made a lot of meals on bread. and inquiring where he got it, I went immediately to the baker's he directed me to in 2nd Street and asked for biscuit, intending such as we had in Boston. But they, it seems, were not made in Philadelphia. Then I asked for a 3-penny loaf and was told they had none such. So not considering or knowing the difference of money and the greater cheapness nor the names of the bread, I made him give me 3-penny worth of any sort. He gave me accordingly 3 great puffy rolls. I was amazed at the quantity, but took it, and having no room in my pockets, walked off with a roll under each arm and eating the other. If you go back to the previous PowerPoint, the very first slide on that you'll see is Benjamin Franklin holding a piece of bread with 2 pieces of bread under his arms. That image from that previous PowerPoint is this exact moment of Franklin going into Philadelphia, some artist rendering of that entrance. So Franklin had already told us he's starving when he's getting off the boat. And so he gets off the boat, he sees a kid eating bread. He says, "Hey kid, where'd you get that bread?" And he tells us, I made many a meal on bread. He was a vegetarian, right? Bread has a lot of calories. Bread will keep you alive. And so the kid told him, "Oh, there's a baker on 2nd Street." And so Ben hustles over there and goes into the baker. Says, "Give me a biscuit." Well, apparently biscuits were a Boston thing, not a Philadelphia, and they didn't bake biscuits down in Philly. And so he said, "Well, give me a 3-penny loaf." But they didn't make 3-penny loaves in Philadelphia. And Ben, apparently getting somewhat frustrated, finally just says, "All right, just give me 3 pennies of anything." To which he says they gave him 3 great puffy rolls. Maybe bread was cheaper in Philadelphia than back in Boston. Philadelphia was a smaller, newer city. It was going to be a big city. It was going to be an important city, but it was still growing. It wasn't as developed in Boston, and sometimes newer cities have lower costs of living. So maybe that's what's going on. You know, Ben was used to Boston, and 3 pennies would get you a single serving amount of bread maybe. But in Philly, it got you more bread. So he had 3 great puffy rolls. Now again, Ben's 17 years old. He doesn't understand things around here. He's a little insecure, it appears. I think if this had happened in Boston and they would have given him this much bread, Ben would have said, no, that's too much. Tell you what, just give me 1 penny worth. But instead, you know, he ordered 3 pennies worth. They gave him 3 pennies worth. So he's like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm going to take it." So he takes it and starts walking off. Right? He sticks 1 under each arm. And he's eating the one. Now, what I want you to start appreciating is how Franklin is making himself look kind of clownish, kind of silly. He's making a lot of bad decisions and just being kind of a dummy as he's walking through Philadelphia. And that's part of the point of the story. This is why he's telling us this. You know, he's dirty, he's smelly, he's tired, he doesn't know where he's going. He's got dirty clothes stuffed coming out of his pockets. He's walking around with all this bread, some of it stuck under his arms while he's, you know, scarfing it down as he goes. He's a bit buffoonish, right? But he continues the story. Thus I went up Market Street as far as 4th Street, passing by the door of Mr. Reed, my future wife's father, when she, standing at the door, saw me and thought I made, as I most certainly did, a most awkward, ridiculous appearance. That's going to be his future wife. I put wife in quotation marks. Maybe we'll talk about that after we're done here. And he looks like a clown. You know, he looks like a fool. He must have done something right later on because she saw him and she still was interested in him later on. If you, again, go back to that previous PowerPoint slide, the first one, you'll see a young woman in a doorway looking at Franklin, and that's his future wife, Deborah Reed. Then I turned and went down Chestnut Street and part of Walnut Street, eating my roll all the way, and coming around, found myself again at Market Street Wharf near the boat I came in. He'd just gone in a circle. Kid's so clueless. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's just aimlessly walking the streets and wound up back where he started again. You know, dude's kind of a clown. To which I went for a draught of river water, and being filled with one of my rolls, gave the other two to a woman and her child that came down the river in the boat with us and were waiting to go further. So it's nice enough for Ben to give up some of that bread. Thus refreshed, I walked up the street, which by this time had many clean-dressed people in it, who were all walking the same way. I joined them, and thereby was led to the great meeting house of the Quakers near the market. I sat down among them, and after looking around for a while and hearing nothing said, being very drowsy through labor and want of rest, the preceding night, I fell fast asleep and continued so till the meeting broke up, when one was kind enough to rouse me. This was therefore the first house I was in or slept in Philadelphia. Okay, there's something really funny about that, but you need to understand the nature of Quaker church services. Okay. Anybody reading this autobiography at the time, just about anybody in the American colonies reading this, would have understood the nature of Quaker church services and therefore got the joke. Okay, but I got to explain it to you. So Ben had just walked essentially in a circle and ended up back at the boat where he started with. And so now he started walking up the street, but he saw a pack of nicely dressed people. And so he just decided, kind of creeper style, I'm just going to follow these people. And he does. And these people were Quakers, and they were going to the great meeting. Meeting house is another name for a church. The Puritans and the Quakers didn't really call their churches churches, they called them meeting houses. And so he's just following these Quakers as they're going to church. Now, the Quakers were a dominant religious group in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. But their numbers were not too great outside of there. I grew up in Whittier, and actually Whittier was founded by Quakers. Whittier was named after the Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. And so I just also happen to know some things about the Quakers just because that's where I grew up. My family weren't Quakers, but you grow up in Whittier, sometimes you learn some things about the Quakers. The Quakers were never a large group of Christians in the United States, but their influence over American history far, far outstripped their numbers. And that was because the Quakers had a very radical idea of human equality. Okay? They very strongly believed in equality. The Quakers believed that each person had within them some special part or some special knowledge of God. They called it the light of God. Each of us has the light of God within us. And because we do, we are all special and we are all equal because of that. No one has more, no one has less. We all have this light of God within us. So people were equal. This is also one of the reasons why Quakers were pacifists also. They were pacifists. They did not believe in killing in the name of war or capital punishment. And because of their ideas of radical equality, they would be some of the Americans that were most heavily involved in trying to eliminate things like racism or inequality in terms of things like women's rights. If you look at the history of the abolitionist movement and where you look at white Americans involved in the abolitionist movement, most of the early abolitionists came from Quaker backgrounds because this was part of their religion. When you look at the early women's rights movement, many of the women involved in the very early women's rights movement came from Quaker backgrounds. All right? And so there were never that many Quakers, particularly outside of Pennsylvania. But their influence on American history was profound. Now, because of this radical commitment to equality, the Quakers didn't like the idea of hierarchy, even in their church services. They really didn't like the idea of a traditional church service where a minister stands up in front of everybody and sermonizes to them, tells them what to think. It seems unequal. We all have the light of God within us. We all have something to share about God and God's nature. So instead, what the Quakers did is they didn't have a formal minister that would run church services. By the way, there are still Quakers today, and they don't really run it the same way. But back in Franklin's time, there was not a minister that stood up in front of everybody and sermonized. Instead, the Quakers would go into the meeting house and they would sit down, and everybody in there would wait for the Lord to put something on their heart to share with everybody else. And so you would sit in silence until somebody was feeling something. And then when somebody was feeling something, they would stand up and share what they had to say with everybody else there. Last night I was reading Romans, and it occurs to me now that such and such and such and such. They would share. And after the person was done sharing what they had to share, they would sit down and you would wait. Wait for somebody else to stand up, feel like the Lord had put something on them. And that would be it. And that you would just get, after it seemed like everybody had had their say, the service was over. But sometimes there were long pauses between when people would speak, because you were just waiting for the Lord to speak to you. Right? And so Franklin says he didn't know where to go. He saw some nice looking people walking down the street, and he just decided to follow them. And they go into the great meeting house of the Quakers, and he sits down and he tells us, I heard nothing said. I looked around. Nobody was saying anything. I was super tired from being on the boat. And he just fell asleep. And he stayed asleep until some nice gentleman at the meeting sort of, must have nudged him on the shoulder and said, hey kid, service is over. You got to go. And so he says, this was the first house I was in or slept in Philadelphia. Look, it's a funny story if you understand the nature of Quaker church services. But look at how clownish Benjamin Franklin is. He walks into the city, young man, little money, dirty, smelly, dirty clothes on, walking around, buying too much food, sticking it under arms, walking in circles, walking into churches, falling asleep in churches. I mean, this just could not start much worse. But that's the point of the story. That's what Franklin's trying to get us to understand. Look at how it started. Look at me now. It's like the meme. How it started, how it's going. Franklin would have been able to do that meme so well. 17-year-old me, clueless, dirty, with a couple loaves of bread stuffed under his arms, asleep at a church. How it started. And then rich Benjamin Franklin, king of Philadelphia, not literally the king of Philadelphia, but, a big man in Philadelphia. This is how it's going, right? This story has resonated with Americans generation after generation because this is the pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Some people have tried to use this as the story of the immigrant coming to America. After all, Benjamin Franklin is stepping off a boat. He is pretty clueless. He doesn't know what to do. However, that's a stretch to try and make this out as the story of a kind of typical immigrant coming to the United States. Yeah, Benjamin Franklin was a bit clueless when he got to Philadelphia. But he was a colonial North American. He was part of the English colonies. He spoke the native tongue fluently. He had a marketable skill that would immediately start translating once he found a job. The history of immigrants coming to America is usually quite a bit rougher than what Benjamin Franklin is describing here. So, this does not really work as a kind of allegory for or a metaphor for a immigrant coming to America. That's going too far. That's a stretch. All right? So let's get back to the PowerPoint here. Well, Franklin gets in there and starts going looking for a job. And he first goes to the son of Bradford, the younger Bradford, who has a printing shop in Philadelphia. And he talks to the younger Bradford and asks for a job. But unfortunately, the younger Bradford had already filled his job. So he doesn't need to hire anybody else here. But Bradford tells Franklin, there's another printer. There was only 2 printers in Philadelphia. There's another man by the name of Keimer. Go talk to Keimer. Keimer might be hiring. And Ben goes to talk to Keimer. And sure enough, Keimer's hiring. And Ben starts working at Keimer's printing house. And almost immediately, Ben realizes coming to Philadelphia is going to be a really good thing. This is going to work out really well. Philadelphia was a smaller city, as I talked about before, than Boston. But it was clearly an important city. It was the most important city in the colony of Pennsylvania and was going to continue to grow. And so Franklin imagined growing along with this city in importance. But what intrigued him the most is both of the printers in Philadelphia, both Bradford and Keimer, were not very good at their chosen occupations. Franklin tells us that Bradford was only kind of semi-literate, which you could imagine for a printer being semi-literate is a problem. You're going to turn out a lot of sloppy work. Keimer, on the other hand, that wasn't his problem. Keimer, Franklin tells us, was a well-read man, quite a literate man. But Keimer's problem was that Keimer was not mechanically inclined. He was not good with the equipment. Ben was both of these things. Ben was very literate. And Ben was also good at maintaining and modifying and operating printing equipment. So Ben is looking at the lay of the landscape. I'm in this city. It's going to be a growing, more powerful city. There's 2 printers here. They're both bad. One of these days, I'm going to save up enough money and I'm going to start my own printing business and I'm going to dominate this town because I'm just so much better than both of these guys. And spoiler alert, that is going to come to pass. That is pretty much what's going to happen. Okay. But again, this is the beginning of that self-made man story that we're going to see here. Ben sees opportunity almost immediately in getting to Philadelphia and starts working towards making that future he imagines a reality. Right? That's what he's about. let's talk about an interesting story of Ben creating a religion. Now, for this is going to be a bit of a goof for Benjamin Franklin. But it highlights some of Franklin's views on religion at the time. So Ben gets this job with Keimer. And one of the things that struck Franklin early about Keimer is Keimer had some really unusual views on religion. The big thing for Keimer about religious devotion should be the wearing of a beard. All men need to wear beards. Franklin tells us that Keimer wore a long beard. And something about this just rubbed Franklin the wrong way. Remember, when we talked about Franklin becoming a deist and then walking away from deism, he walked away from it because deism did not have a built-in morality. And he found himself and his friends that he convinced to become deists became worse people. Because without the threat of punishment from God, they made poor moral decisions. And so after abandoning deism, morality became the cornerstone of what Franklin thought should be important about religion. Religion should help you to be a better, more moral, more ethical person. Well, growing a beard as a sign of devotion doesn't make you a better or worse person. And I think that's what kind of annoyed Ben about this whole beard thing. Because he thought people with religion should focus on what that religion teaches you about being good to other people. But instead, Keimer was always talking about his beard. And men should wear beards. And so Ben decides to have some fun with Keimer. All right? So Ben proposes to Keimer that they would start their own religion. Now again, this is a joke for Ben. But Ben gets the impression that Keimer would really be into this. And in fact, as we'll see, he is really into this idea. So Ben approaches Keimer and says, hey, Keimer, you've got some really interesting views on religion. And I think I have some really, really interesting ideas about religion. What do you say you and I create our own religion? What do you think, Keimer? Keimer's into it. He's like, yeah, let's do it. So Ben says, well, why don't we go back and forth and talk about what will be the elements of our religious faith? You go ahead and start, Keimer. What do you want to start with? And Ben knows where Keimer's going. Keimer says, beards. Men need to wear beards. As a sign of devotion to God, we will wear beards. This was perfectly predictable for Franklin. He knew it was coming, and it's no problem. What does Ben have to do? Just stop shaving. No problem. Now Keimer turns around and says, okay, Ben, what's going to be important for you? What else will we incorporate into our religion? And this is where the fun comes in for Ben. Ben was still a vegetarian at this point, and so Ben says, vegetable diet. As a sign of devotion to God, we will adhere to the vegetable diet. Now, Keimer's really excited about this religion, so he says yes. Yes, let's do it. But Ben knows. He tells us. Keimer liked to eat. And Keimer in particular seemed to like to eat things that had parents. So he knew this was going to be a struggle. And that's where the fun was going to come in for Ben. Watching Keimer try to adhere to the vegetable diet. Struggle with it. It was going to be fun. And so Keimer has that, initial enthusiasm with an idea. He hasn't had to skip any meals yet. He hasn't had to avoid meat yet. So he just easily says, yes. All right. So they go back and forth and talk about what they're going to do. Keimer was going to be the kind of front man, the messianic prophet kind of figure. And Ben said that he will be the kind of guy behind the scenes, the writer of the sacred text. That'll be his role. So they work all this stuff out. Keimer's into it. Ben's going to have some fun with this. And so sure enough, for a few days, Keimer is adhering to the vegetable diet, but Ben tells us he could tell Keimer was getting a bit more agitated as time went on, and he was missing eating meat. Until one day, Keimer just pretty much freaks out and goes and eats a whole pig. And Ben tells us that's the end of the attempt to create a religion. Right? It was a joke for Ben. But it highlights again some of Franklin's views on religion, which was what did Ben prioritize about religious devotion? He prioritized morality over outward signs of devotion like wearing a beard. All right, that's a good place to stop. In our next lecture, we'll pick back up of an opportunity Ben has to go to England that's going to take him away from Philadelphia for a while. All right, everybody. See you next time.